World War I was a global conflict. It started in 1914. By 1917 the war had been raging for 3 years. Millions of soldiers were dead. Countries were exhausted. But the year 1917 would prove decisive. The United States joined the war. Russia, caught in revolution, would leave it. This set the stage for the final act of the Great War. In 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The US had tried to remain neutral, however several factors led it to join the Allied powers. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare threatened American ships. The Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, further angered the US. The entry of the US was a turning point. American troops and resources boosted the morale of the Allied forces. It tipped the balance in their favor. While the US joined the war, Russia faced its own turmoil. The Bolshevik Revolution erupted in 1917. The Tsar was overthrown. A new communist government came to power. The communists wanted peace. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918. Russia's exit was a blow to the Allies, but it allowed Germany to focus on the Western Front. Germany hoped to win the war before American forces arrived in full force. With Russia out of the war, Germany launched a massive offensive in the spring of 1918. This was known as the Spring Offensive. German troops pushed into Allied lines. They hoped to break through and capture Paris, but the offensive stalled. The German troops were exhausted. They had been fighting for years. The arrival of fresh American troops bolstered the Allied defenses. The Spring Offensive failed. It was Germany's last major attempt to win the war. The 100 Days Offensive. After the failure of the Spring Offensive, the Allies launched their own attack. The Spring Offensive, also known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, was Germany's last major attempt to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Despite initial successes, the offensive ultimately failed, leaving the German forces exhausted and vulnerable. The Allies saw this as an opportunity to turn the tide of the war in their favor. This was the 100 Days Offensive. It marked a significant shift in the momentum of the war. The Allies, now bolstered by fresh American troops and improved coordination among their forces, were determined to push the Germans back and bring an end to the conflict. It began in August 1918. The offensive was meticulously planned and executed with the aim of breaking through the heavily fortified German lines. The initial attack was launched by the British Fourth Army, supported by Australian and Canadian forces near the town of Amiens. The offensive was a series of coordinated attacks along the Western Front. These attacks were designed to keep the German forces off balance and prevent them from regrouping. The Allies employed new tactics and technologies, including the use of tanks, aircraft, and improved artillery coordination to achieve their objectives. The Allies had more men and resources than ever before. The influx of American troops provided a much-needed boost to the Allied forces, both in terms of manpower and morale. Additionally, the Allies had superior logistical support, ensuring that their troops were well supplied and equipped for the battles ahead. They pushed back the German army. The relentless pressure applied by the Allied forces forced the Germans to retreat, abandoning their defensive positions and leaving behind valuable equipment and supplies. The German army, already weakened by years of attrition, struggled to mount a coherent defense against the advancing Allies. Key battles like Amiens and the Second Battle of the Marne weakened Germany further. The Battle of Amiens in particular was a turning point in the war. The surprise attack by the Allies resulted in a significant breakthrough, with German forces suffering heavy casualties and losing large swaths of territory. The Second Battle of the Marne saw the Allies successfully countering a German offensive, further depleting German resources and morale. The German army was on the verge of collapse. The sustained Allied offensives, combined with internal unrest and economic hardship within Germany, led to a rapid deterioration of the German war effort. By November 1918, the German High Command realized that the war was unwinnable, leading to the signing of the armistice on November 11th, which brought an end to the fighting on the Western Front. A world silent. Faced with defeat, Germany sought an armistice. The relentless battles had drained the nation's resources and morale. Soldiers, weary and broken, longed for an end to the bloodshed. The German High Command realized that continuing the fight was futile. They had no choice but to seek a ceasefire. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. It is not a peace treaty, but a temporary halt to hostilities. The hope was that this would lead to a more permanent resolution. The terms of the armistice were harsh, but they were accepted. The world held its breath, waiting for the moment when the guns would finally fall silent. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent. After 4 long years of relentless warfare, the sound of silence was almost deafening. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches, unsure if the ceasefire would hold. The once chaotic battlefields were now eerily quiet. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. The war was over. The world celebrated. Millions had died. Empires had fallen. The signing marked the end of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. People took to the streets in joy, but the scars of war were deep. Families mourned their lost loved ones, and nations began the long process of rebuilding. The world was forever changed. The landscape of Europe was altered, both physically and politically. Cities lay in ruins, and the old world order had been shattered. The war had left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of humanity. The cost of the conflict was immeasurable, and its effects would be felt for generations to come. But the peace was fragile. The armistice was only a temporary measure, and the underlying tensions that had led to the war were far from resolved. The leaders of the victorious nations gathered to negotiate the terms of the peace treaty. The future of Europe hung in the balance, and the decisions made in the coming months would shape the course of history. The terms of the peace treaty were yet to be decided. The Paris Peace Conference would bring together diplomats from around the world to determine the fate of the defeated Central Powers. The negotiations were complex and fraught with tension. Each nation had its own interests and demands, and finding a consensus would prove to be a monumental challenge. The world watched anxiously, hoping for a lasting peace. Section 7. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, leaders from the victorious nations met in Versailles, France. Their goal was to create a lasting peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty officially ended World War I. It also imposed harsh penalties on Germany. Germany was blamed for the war. It had to pay huge reparations. Its army was severely limited. It lost territory. Many Germans felt humiliated by these terms. This resentment would have lasting consequences. A flawed peace? The Treaty of Versailles was controversial. Some argued that it was too harsh on Germany. They feared it would lead to future conflict. Others believed it was necessary to prevent another war. The treaty failed to address the underlying causes of the war. The treaty left a legacy of bitterness and resentment. It contributed to economic instability in Germany. It failed to create a lasting peace. Ultimately, it set the stage for another world war. A world reshaped. The final years of World War I were a pivotal period in history. The war, which began in 1914, had already caused unprecedented destruction and loss of life. By 1917, the world was weary of the conflict, and the soldiers in the trenches faced unimaginable hardships. The battles of these years were some of the most brutal, with new technologies like tanks and chemical weapons making the fighting even more deadly. They saw the United States become a global power. Before the war, the US had largely stayed out of European affairs, but the entry of American forces in 1917 marked a significant shift. The fresh troops and resources provided by the United States were crucial in tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. American soldiers, known as doughboys, were celebrated as heroes upon their arrival in Europe, and their involvement signaled the beginning of a new era in international relations. They witnessed the rise of communism in Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a direct consequence of the war's pressures. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and withdrew Russia from the conflict. This not only changed the course of the war, but also set the stage for the establishment of the Soviet Union. The rise of communism would have profound implications for global politics throughout the 20th century. Most importantly, they led to the end of the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. The signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, brought an end to the fighting. Across the world, people celebrated the conclusion of a war that had claimed millions of lives. Soldiers returned home to joyous welcomes, but the scars of the conflict would remain for years to come. The war left millions dead. The scale of the casualties was staggering, with entire generations of young men lost. The physical and psychological wounds inflicted on those who survived were immense. Hospitals were filled with wounded soldiers, many of whom would never fully recover. The landscapes of Europe were forever altered, with vast cemeteries and memorials serving as a testament to the war's devastation. It redrew the map of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles and other peace agreements led to significant territorial changes. Empires that had stood for centuries, such as the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, were dismantled. New nations were created, and borders were redrawn, often without regard for the ethnic and cultural realities on the ground. These changes sowed the seeds for future conflicts and instability in the region. It ushered in an era of uncertainty and change. The end of the war did not bring immediate peace and stability. Instead, the world faced economic turmoil, political upheaval, and social unrest. Cities across Europe were in ruins, and rebuilding efforts were slow and arduous. The war had shattered the old order, and the new world that emerged was fraught with challenges. The world would never be the same. The impact of World War I was felt in every corner of the globe. It changed the way wars were fought, the way nations interacted, and the way people viewed their place in the world. The war's legacy influenced art, literature, and philosophy as people grappled with the horrors they had witnessed. The 1920s saw a mix of disillusionment and a desire for change as societies sought to rebuild and move forward. The legacy of World War I continues to shape our world today. The lessons learned from the conflict have informed international policies and peacekeeping efforts. Memorials and museums dedicated to the war serve as reminders of the sacrifices made and the importance of striving for a more peaceful world. As we reflect on this pivotal period in history, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for a better future.